Hi, I'm Bronwyn Williams. We're back with the small print, and today my guest is Andrew McLuhan. Andrew, will you please introduce yourself the way you would choose to be introduced given the opportunity, which I'm now forcing upon you, as that is the way we introduce our guests on this show?
Happy to. Hi, Bronwyn. I'm Andrew McLuhan. I'm a writer, an author, a poet, an archivist, an explorer, a teacher, and just generally a pretty happy guy.
Excellent. I saw online you were also a former upholsterer, which I'm in dire need of at the moment. Apparently, it's like impossible to find someone to replace the button on
Yeah,
a
I cannot help you.
cup. No. But anyway, we invited you on the show because of not only your own personal history and career portfolio, which is probably almost as checkered as my own, but also because of your family connections. So maybe you can start by telling people who are not familiar with who you are or who you come from and the impact that your family and just a couple of generations has had on the world and the way we think about it.
Happy to. Um, yeah, so I discovered as a child that people knew who my grandfather was and that that wasn't normal. My grandfather became kind of famous in the 1960s into the 70s for studying the effects of technology on people and culture uh, and being quite public about it. He became kind of a household name in the later 1960s, and people around the world knew the name Marshall McLuhan and the medium is the message and the global village, even if they didn't quite understand what that meant. My father, Eric McLuhan, was Marshall's eldest son, child, and worked with him kind of from the mid 60s onward till Marshall died in 1980. And then just kept going on his own, buried away in his library, writing and researching. And I got in the work a bit later. I just became fascinated by the whole idea that an English professor, because my grandfather was an English professor at the University of Toronto, somehow got interested in technology and culture. And it's fascinating to me that the two things aren't as unrelated as they might appear on the surface.
Absolutely not. I mean, technology is just another language, a way of expressing what we want and manipulating the universe in order to get it for ourselves, right? I mean, that's what we try to do with language, and that's what we try to do with digital technology too.
Certainly. And not only that, but literature is technology. Poetry
Mm.
is a technology, an ancient technology, as a matter of fact. And the things that we can understand about literature and poetry are, in many cases, things that we can understand about technology more broadly.
Yeah, absolutely. That cuts in both directions. Like language and words are a form of technology. Technology can also be seen as a form of language. But let's get back to the point you opened with there when trying to describe your quite unique little family business, as I think you've
Uh-huh.
described it quite recently. And that is what do people misunderstand about the message that you are now the torchbearer of?
Oh, wow. That's an interesting question to ask. What do people misunderstand? Well, there's often confusion around this notion of technological determinism. People think that well, it's one odd thing was in his day, people thought it ironic that Marshall McLuhan was talking against technology and saying that the book is dead, especially as a literature teacher, English professor, and writer of books. He never said that print was dead or books were dead. He did say that we were post-literate. And there's a bit of a difference. The difference being what he was saying, and the underlying narrative of his famous 1964 work, Understanding Media, is that the age of print and mechanism had passed, and the new electric age was here and here to stay. That didn't mean that books would disappear. He never said they would. It did mean that they didn't control things the way they did. That something else was in charge now. And this notion of obsolescence, which is something that is a universal principle of technology. Anytime we have a new technology, we make current or older technologies obsolete. But that doesn't mean they disappear. It just means that they change their role. So books are still an important part of society, but well, it was I believe a Frenchman named Lamartine who, when the newspapers came out, said that the book arrives too late. And what he meant by that is that it takes a couple of years to write and edit and publish a book. If you're trying to get information out, the book arrives too late. The press arrives overnight. And that means that you have a completely different culture and different society. And in that sense, the book is obsolete because the book can't keep up with the speed of print and the newspaper and the telegraph. So that's one thing people misunderstand. The other thing tied to that is that Marshall had opinions or feelings one way or the other about the situation. In fact, much of his work involved the very difficult task of setting aside your personal feelings and opinions in order to study the situation for what it was. And deciding whether something is good or bad is something that can only happen once we completely understand it. His point was that it is ridiculous to try and say something is good or bad before you completely understand it.
But can we ever understand what we are in the process of creating? I mean, that's like trying to ask if we can understand ourselves, right? Like the machine is insufficient to read the machine.
No, it's a good question, and one I think we know the answer to. But I think we can do better than we do, and he certainly believed the same. Um, you wouldn't fire a gun if you didn't see where it was going, right? You wouldn't just fire off. Well, and he made this point. I was reading that in an interview, I think yesterday or the day before, and it struck me because we're careful about things we know the effects of, and if we don't know the effects of something, we should be a lot more careful of it. The point being with technology, in almost every case, we don't know the effects of it until we look back and see how we've changed. But I think my father and my grandfather spent their lives trying to discover certainly universal principles about technology so that we might do better and understand more about them and then choose with an informed opinion whether we want to proceed in certain ways or not. In the same way that today we wouldn't dream of releasing a drug without understanding very closely what its effect is going to be on people.
Well, it's really interesting that you say that because you talk about drugs and you talk about technology and how if we don't understand the effect, we need to be more careful before we pull the proverbial trigger. But at the same time, I can't help thinking of these sorts of conversations almost exactly the same conversations that we fail to have when it comes to policy at a sort
Mm.
of governmental level, right? Like the greater the policy, the less questions we ask, right? Rather than the other way around. I don't know if you see parallels there, because I'm going to sort of square that circle as we bring it back to, I think the more topical conversations around technology are very intersected with policy and how we are going to address it going forward. But I wanted to find if you had a general comment before I get into that.
Yeah, I mean, the conversation around drugs and technology is useful in some cases, but it's not a one-to-one metaphor because it's quite easy in comparison to tell the effects of a drug. It can be
Mm.
very difficult to tell the effects of a technology. Although they're dramatic, they're somehow beneath our notice. It's a strange paradox. Um, Everybody understands that we're changing and that things are not the same, but it's almost a willful ignorance to discover the causality at play. And that's because it's a difficult thing to understand. With the regulation of pharmacology, we have fairly simple and effective criteria that drugs have to be safe and effective for human consumption. Safe meaning they don't make us sick. and effective, meaning they do what they're supposed to do. But it's difficult to translate that onto technology in a meaningful way because the way that technology affects us, if you take a drug and you start throwing up or you go out of your head, it's pretty obvious what happened, right? You don't take the drug and you're okay, or or other substance. But when it comes to technology, technologies affect us on a very basic sensorial level. They rewire us on our senses and cognitively, and they reshape our identities, both who we are as beings, but also our sense of who we are. And it's very difficult for us to recognize the relationship between the events, like something like the iPhone coming into broad circulation, and then something like, you know, increased anxiety or body images or things like this. And we tend to want to blame content rather than form. And while content is not necessarily innocent, the structural changes which happen to us come from the structural nature of the technology.
Yeah, that's an interesting point and a nuanced one because, as you say, we tend to blame the content or the message rather than the media through which it is distributed to us. But there's other layers behind that, and that's the layers of both intended and unintended sort of impetus behind that, right? So it's
Uh-huh.
like it's one thing blaming the content or the media, but you got to look behind that to the impetus, like how did this start and what are the motivations behind that? And some of that is deliberate and directed, and some of that is unexplained and unintended. And that's what makes technology, as you say, and even other sorts of technologies like policy and like language,
Mhm.
so difficult to categorize as being right or wrong, which is really what it comes down to at the end of the day. So when people hear your message, I think quite often people hear it as being like, oh, we must be more careful with technology, and that requires some sorts of regulation or some sort of suppression because it's scary and dangerous to us. But at the same time, that's not necessarily what you're saying. You're taking a much more neutral stance there when you say that technology changes us. But it's a very different question to say whether that change is bad or good, or bad for whom, or good for whom, right?
Exactly. It's a difficult conversation because, a lot of it is very nuanced and it's subtle. I think one of the main points is that unintended consequences aren't necessarily unavoidable consequences.
Mm.
And I think things often get written off as unintended consequences. And what are you going to do? Um, but I don't think it's the case that they're entirely unavoidable. The thing is, when you look at the effects of technology and you weigh, if you want to call them the intended consequences against the unintended consequences, like the unintended consequences, well, whichever way I'm going, always add up to be much greater than the intended consequences or stated benefits, right? Like, oh, the internet is going to make us all connected together and make for a beautiful new Garden of Eden. Well, plus you get scammers and you get identity theft and you get identity change and all these things. And you add them up, to bring it back to drugs, you see an ad for a new drug on television, and you've got a couple hand in hand frolicking through the sea mist and seagulls soaring overhead and having the time of their lives. And then in the background, you've got some announcer speaking really fast about all the horrible things that are going to happen to you if you actually take this drug, right? Um, but we ignore that, and we concentrate on frolicking through the surf with our loved one, right? Um, all the wishful thinking in the world isn't going to save us from technology, if indeed we need to be saved. But the thing is, it's a fairly simple but complicated formula that a new technology means a new person, means a new culture on a certain level. And new cultures and old cultures aren't necessarily compatible. Um, the things which we value often come as side effects of technology, like privacy and individualism. These are all things that came in with print and literacy. Without print and literacy, without that structure to hold them up, they become not only difficult to maintain, but they don't have the same value to us. So, are these good or bad things really depends on where you sit. Uh, and again, this comes back a lot to the sensory effects of technology. One easier way to think about it is to think about there's this great book by a fellow named Jacques Lusseran, and he wrote a book called And There Was Light. In the book, he talks about how at a young age he became blind within a span of days, schoolyard accident. And he describes in exquisite detail how, as his visual faculty dimmed, his other senses perked up. His sense of hearing became more acute, his sense of touch more sensitive. We've learned that when you affect one sense, you affect all your senses because our senses exist in a balance between them. And really, who we are as people is what that balance equals. So, for example, somebody who can't see, who is blind, um, well, might not care whether the background of their Zoom looks like yours or looks like mine, right? On my walls, I have lots of pictures and little mementos and visual things, and it's very visually busy. A blind person doesn't care about that, right? A blind person doesn't value visual art. Why would they? It doesn't make any sense. But in our culture, we value visual art very greatly. Um, when you change the sense ratios, you change the person and you change the culture and you change the values. So to ask how this technology mixes with our values is going to be a different answer today than it will be tomorrow when that technology is entrenched in our culture. And all of a sudden we value things like being able to reach somebody any time of the night and day, responding to messages instantly, showing likes and dislikes, and registering approval and disapproval, and all these things. Technologies become values.
So let me ask you a slightly harder question then. In our current era, then, what are some of the values that are shifting? And you can answer that in two ways. You can either look at what are the values that have shifted, and we can give a watershed period. Let's pick the COVID lockdowns. That was a point that we all can. It's all in living memory, but it was a definitive watershed in our culture. From then until now, what values have shifted? And in many cases, irrevocably, they're not going back. And
Yep.
also then sort of just looking ahead, which is obviously an unfalsifiable answer, so you can answer it if you like. What are some of the values you think are going to be further changed and challenged thanks to the new advances in technology? And at the moment, sort of the catch-all bucket for that would be the age of AI, for
Yeah.
example.
Well, I see COVID actually as less of a biological moment than a technological moment. Um, it was uh, well, it really depends how you want to talk about it. If you want to be more conspiratorial minded, you could say it was the excuse for the New World Order. Um, you know, regardless of how you want
Take
to.
opportunities where you find them, right?
Right. Well,
Or where you
regardless of how
get
you
them,
want.
depending on how conspiratorial you really want to be.
Sure. I think it's easy to write things off as unintended consequences. It's easy to write things off as global conspiracies. One of the things my grandfather discovered to his surprise was that the people in charge have not much greater understanding of how things work than the rest of us. He was quite shocked to find that when he spoke at the Bilderberg meeting in 1969. And here he thought he would be addressing, call them the Illuminati if you want, call them the power brokers, the leaders of countries, captains of industry. He thought he would be speaking to peers who understood the ways technologies worked, who understood media. He discovered they don't understand anything, really. They do understand power, but they don't understand the subtle nature of how to steer it, except with brute force. They don't understand media. essentially, except in vague ways. But to the point, uh, COVID meant that we had the excuse to do things like, go extremely online. There were some really interesting thing that happened, both in the natural world, apart from us, and in our world culturally. In the natural world, it was really amazing to see how quickly nature took over. Uh,
Mm,
People noticed bird song in cities for the first time in their lives. Deer, coyotes, foxes were coming into urban areas. A town in Wales got overrun by mountain goats. Uh, and this happened so quickly when human activity stopped being a barrier. Well, another thing that happened was the interruption in education, which became a diversion in education. And I have two small children. They're now 8 and 10. So they were, 4 and 6, uh, whatever.
mm,
And there was there's such a disconnect between the things we say and the things we do when it's convenient. And I'm speaking on a government level because all of a sudden classes went completely online, no in person. So my kids were being asked to, and they were in kindergarten and grade one. My kids were being required to be in class online, so on Zoom, for 6+ hours a day. Then I go to the Government of Canada website, Health Canada, and I look at their what they say is safe screen time for a child that young, and it says something very different. In fact, it says an hour or less, and preferably educational content, as if that makes a difference, right? Once they say better educational content, I know they don't understand what they're talking about because whether it's education or entertainment, you're still, whether you're taking the pill for fun or taking it because you've got a stomach ache, you're taking the pill, you know? Uh, so if that distinction is lost on them, my confidence is lost in them. And then you look at things like statistics today that the average American spends between 8 and 18, spends upwards of 12 hours a day on screens and again, they call it non-educational content, as if the other 8 hours a day they spend doing schoolwork is somehow different in effect, which it's not. It's slightly different in experience or in intent, but intended consequences and actual consequences can be very different things. So, uh, we had huge social changes in how we gather, how we learn, how we behave, and what was doing a Zoom call like this was a fairly rare thing before COVID, and now it's the norm, right? Earlier this week, I went to Toronto, which is a 2.5 hour drive from me in the country, for an interview. And the interview for somebody who's writing a book on digital art was scheduled to be on Zoom, but I said, why don't I come into town? Because I understand there's a world of difference between doing something on a screen and doing something in person. Um, I do a fair bit of teaching, and teaching on a screen and teaching to a room full of people are completely different activities. Um, there's a lot lost in translation. There's a lot that we miss when we're not together. Um, it's a different experience, and it has different effects. It makes for different people. It makes for different social responses. It makes for a different process of learning. it makes for a completely different socialization, which is, um, from my perspective, probably the main thing we learn from going to school is how to behave with other people. And how you behave with other people when you're a series of boxes on a screen and how you behave with people when you're in proximity are very different things. So, what's the answer? Uh, I really don't believe that the majority of people had or have, you know, New World Order agendas in doing this. They're just trying to do their job, trying to help look after kids. But very quickly, temporary measures become de facto modes of being, right? And now all our meetings are online. A lot of our work is remote. And there are large cultural and economic consequences for this. Um, One thing that we've learned is that there is no going back. There's only going forward.
Yeah, I think I agree with most of what you're saying there. I have a 9-year-old daughter too, so she was 5 at the time of the Great Shutdown. So very similar experience there. And I'm consistently amazed at how different her perceived life is supposed to be to the life I had as a child, but at the same time, how absolutely the same it is. So I'm always really interested in what doesn't change about human nature and what does, and how, in fact, what doesn't change about human nature is actually the greatest predictor of the direction that technology is unfolding within, right? So I certainly see technology as sort of lagging culture in that regard, in that it fulfills more and more of our superficial and base desires, right? That's why we build these layers of technology. So predicting the direction and the trajectory of technology is quite easy, but where it's really hard is predicting the fallout, as you said, those consequences. So from my perspective, like all COVID did was roll up sort of 20 years of what I certainly saw to be the foreseeable future into 2 or 3 years. I mean, this is my job, so I tend to look at the stuff and I was like, oh, tick, 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 tick. We've just accelerated 20 years of foresight into like a couple of weeks, done. And the next sort of phase is also quite predictable. Not that I really want to get into that because that starts getting quite dark and people don't like that. But then again, people wouldn't have liked if you had spoken to people my age 20 years ago saying the future is going to be you alone in bed with your replica chatbot companion. I'd be like, I don't want that. That's terrible. But at the same time, I'm like, yeah, you're going to like that one day. Like one day you're going to find that completely acceptable. Like
Right.
it's not. And like telling people what they're going to have in the future based on what they want now is not a very popular conversation to have at all. But at the same time, as I said, you can't predict that what technology is going to deliver for us because we are impatient, selfish creatures as a pack. Of course, there's always exceptions, and we always try to rage against the beasts within us and feed the right wolves, etc. But in general, the progress of technology has been giving us more and more of what we want, and we know very clearly what we want. We don't like to talk about it because that's uncomfortable. What we don't understand is the costs and the payments that we have for getting more of what we want. And the craziest thing to me about that, especially again, looking at small children compared to myself, is that they don't know what they've lost because actually, if you look at the photograph albums, if you look at the day-to-day sort of scheduling, it's not that different to what my life was. Then the moral panic was around like sort of satanic rock music or like TV time for children. It's the same conversation we're having now. And yet we just sort of normalized that and moved on one sort of generational sort of hop at a time. And like, I will never know what my mother had that I never had that I lost out on because essentially we just got what we wanted. We got the junk food without having to eat the peas and carrots. But I never had the freedom to roam in the street. My child will never know the freedom of playing with friends in the same way. I mean, they do play, and the parallels are so beautiful too. Like she spends time now at the moment on Roblox, and they still do the same things we did in the 90s. They play with dolls, they create avatars, they dress them up. They're just doing them in a slightly different format. They still talk on the phone, and now they use headphones instead of using a landline. Like they do the same things, but at the same time, they've lost the intangible, not the tangible. And like that's what seems to be the path of technology when I look at it. It gives us more of what we think we want, but we lose the things that we don't even notice that we had along the way. And that seems to be the general path of society, whether you want to look at that through an anti-capitalist lens or a technologist lens or whatever else there is. And I'm really curious as to your thoughts as to those things that we are losing, but we don't even notice that we're losing them.
Yeah. Well, these are the actual terms of service.
Yeah, the T's and C's, the Faustian bargain. You gotta pay that pound of flesh sooner or later. But the payment feels painless because it's paid by people who never had to lose it, if that makes sense.
Well, it's that, and a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, it's all stuff we want. We want convenience. We want stuff cheaper and faster and better. We want less friction, and we get it. But there is that cost.
There is a cost, and the cost is felt more by the old culture than the new culture,
Mm.
because the new culture doesn't feel the loss, you
They
know,
never had it. Yeah.
precisely. But the old culture does, and the old culture just reminisces about the good old days and when I was a kid. Um, uh, you know, but we're always going, speaking very generally, we're always going to look back fondly on our childhood and tell our kids, well, man, it's too bad you don't have what we had. And that's going to be what your daughter's going to say to her daughter, just as it's kind of what I say to my sons, although they have a little bit of they have more of an old school kind of upbringing here in the country where they do play outside and with all the
Mm.
kids and everything. Um, you know, there are some people who are a little better at it, but these are people like Mennonite sects. These are people who seem to understand that if you want to preserve culture, you have to conserve technology. So this is the reason why they don't necessarily bring in every new gadget that comes along. They understand that their culture moves on a horse and carriage. Their culture dies in a self-driving car. And they're both heavy costs. The one is more stark to us because you see these people riding around in black suits and parking their buggies and stuff, and women wearing long dresses and head coverings, and they're out there plowing their field with a horse and stuff. And they're almost an object of ridicule. But this is if it's inelegant, if it's heavy-handed, it's effective. Um, it's an extreme, but it is a way. Uh, and it should be, I don't think we take the lesson from that we could, which is that, just how profound cultural and technological change are intertwined. And that you can't really have one without the other. As you said, a main characteristic of the post-COVID change was the acceleration, the speed with which it happened. Um, and that is both, there's a blessing and a curse in there. My grandfather Marshall liked to quote Bertrand Russell, who said, if we only raise the temperature of the bathwater by half a degree every hour, we wouldn't know when to scream. So when cultural change happens really, really slowly, we don't notice it. And in fact, we have time to adjust. Just like when you're sitting in a lukewarm bath and you slowly add more hot, hot water, you can get that bath up to a really hot temperature and it's pleasant. But if you were to try to step into that hot, hot bath from the lukewarm room, you would pull your foot out, having almost burnt it. Um, so the thing about rapid technological change is that it happens so fast, we can't hope to adjust. We just have to go with it. And it's the effect of putting our foot in a boiling hot bath, which hurts. but we have the opportunity to notice it. I don't think it's a coincidence my grandfather wrote the work that he did in the time that he did, because it was in the 20th century that our technological and cultural bathwater went through the roof in terms of temperature, and we could notice it for the first time. For thousands of years, technological progress took decades, centuries, millennia to go global and pierce through different cultures. Print moved at a very slow speed. It took decades for the printing press to go around the world and modify cultures. It takes OpenAI's latest GPT a day or two to get millions of active users, right?
Yeah.
So acceleration, I don't think is the value that some people, you know, think it is. But it certainly is an opportunity to notice some things and maybe to think differently about how we design and implement technologies, especially as we understand that the gap between cause and effect uh, shortens to almost nothing in our day.
What you're saying is absolutely correct. However, there is an additional challenge there that like acceleration might not be a universal value. Neither might be, incidentally, homogenization, which is also one of those sort of seemingly inevitable trajectories of technology. As much as it exposes us to more different cultures, sort of mushes us together and turns us into a more and more a universal blob from which there is less and less chance of escape. Like you talk about the Amish or other religious sects that are trying to sort of insulate themselves. That becomes, there's less and less space to do that. Much like with wild animals, there's less and less space to be a rhino. You could only be a rhino in a zoo or in a reserve or in a farm, like that sort of thing happens. But that's one point. The other point is, of course, when it comes, as you're saying, to like this homogenization, acceleration, they're not universal values. They're very individual values. But much like with questions of policy and questions of taste and questions of economy, it doesn't really matter what the majority say here. On the one hand, technology is giving us what democracy gives us, what we think we want, which is not necessarily what we want because it comes at different costs. On the other hand, the pace of technology is set by the fastest goat in the shed, right? And there's not much you can do to roll that back. This is a very sort of classic Pandora's box kind of problem here. But once these technologies are out in the wild, you can't rein them back. It only takes one guy. The squeakiest wheel gets the grease. Like all of these sorts of things. It becomes the tyranny of the minority. So the vote of the majority is, we want more stuff cheaper. We want to live longer. We want less pain and suffering. We want all of these things, which, as I said, are very obvious to identify. And the technologist says, yes, I can give it to you. And before you've even had a chance to read those terms and conditions, it's been given. And once it's been given, you can't take it back. You can at best reduce the speed with which it continues, but you cannot roll that back. It's that first point moves everyone. So again, you've kind of got this sort of this two-leveled problem, the problem of the masses that get what they want, which is the lowest common denominator, which is not good for us. I mean, we know children would like to eat chips and lie on the couch and not go to school. Basically, like that's what adults want too. We want an easy, soft life, and technology gives it to us. And once it's given it to us, you can't be a minority that sort of opts out of that, or you can only do it at great, great cost, because society is a collective beast. We are pack animals. We are interconnected, and increasingly so. So have you got any thoughts on unraveling that particular mess?
Well, it's difficult. We all want the good things and we don't want the bad things. We want to have some drinks. We don't want to be hungover, you know.
There's a pull for that.
We want to have all the beautiful, rich meals, and we don't want to have to go to the gym.
Oh, there's Ozempic for that. We've got technology's got a solution for everything.
Oh yeah, and what happens if you stop taking Ozempic?
Well,
You
you get richer, or you lose your money as along with your waistline, right? Because that's the other unfairness of this nice socialized world we have. Like there's a
know,
reason why you once that's available, you have to do it. Because if you don't do it, it's got real costs in terms of how much you're going to earn, who you're going to be able to mate with and produce your future progeny through, and all the rest of it, right? So it
yeah,
becomes, I'm saying, it's a trap. Like once it's out there, you have to adapt to it. It's the costs of opting out of it grow as exponentially as the technology does. Like the cost of being Amish in the 1950s was much lower than the cost of being so today.
right. So we've hit probably on one of the more difficult problems of it, which is that um, people want everything, and they don't want we don't we don't want to accept that we can't have everything
Mm,
now, right? And the real fact of the matter is um, that if we want to preserve anything about our culture, we have to take more care. We have to take our time. Um, I do think a lot, even though it's an imperfect analogy, I do think a lot about the creation of the FDA in the United States in the early 20th century with the Food and Drug Safety Act. This act that forced industry, pharmaceutical, culinary, food and drink industry to make sure that their products were safe and effective.
mm,
Um, this meant that they had to do a lot of testing, right? Before they could release a product to market. They had to make sure that this wasn't going to kill anybody or, have very deleterious side effects. And how this happened was people were getting sick from tinned foods, canned meat, and things like this, getting sick and dying. And they demanded their government do something about this. Now, industry said, oh, well, look, it's not in our best interest to kill our consumers. You can trust us. We're going to do what's best. Why would we kill our people? We don't need those regulations. You're going to cause us so much expense. You're going to delay our products going to market, and that's unfair. You know, that's not what we value. That's not a fair capitalist system. Um, but people were getting sick and dying, and they forced the politicians to do something. So they did. Now, 100 years later, are Pfizer or Bayer or Coca-Cola or anybody else hurting for profits uh, because they have to take this time to test and make sure their products they minimize the harm that they do? No, they make money hand over fist. But you can imagine a technology company will have the same argument. You know, uh, you can't ask us to delay bringing our product to market. Somebody else is going to get there quicker. This is not our system. But uh, people, I think what needs to happen is people need to get sick enough of being messed with by technologies that they demand change. It's not easy. We don't actually have the tools to measure the effects of these things the way we can measure the effects of drugs or foods on people. Um, because it's like the state of medicine before the microscope. Before we could see bacteria and understand that if you're performing surgery, you need to keep your instruments sterilized. You need to wash your hands. Um, that was ridiculous, right? But we see the bacteria, um, and all of a sudden we can understand it. So, because we don't really have the instruments to show um, the the sensorial, cognitive, neural changes in us, it's a very difficult thing to. I mean, it's easy to say, well, design your stuff better. But how? That's a
Hmm.
that's a whole other thing. But again, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. We shouldn't head there because again, it comes down to values, and I value certain things, and I'd like to see them persist. I can only do so much myself. Um, the easy solution would be for us all to throw our cell phones in the ocean, right, or whatever. But who can do that? It's only the most privileged person can get by without a smartphone, probably because their assistant has one, right? Most people, we need them to do everything increasingly. I can't park my car without an app because there's no more meters to throw a quarter into. We become increasingly tethered to these things, and it comes at a cost, at a great cost. Um,
Hmm. I suppose what is most chilling for me is that coming back to the point we made earlier, that so much of what is lost was unnoticed. In fact, so much as what was lost by previous generations. So we don't have a language for that loss. We can't articulate it, we can't find it, we can't see it, we don't know what it is. And that problem gets perpetuated every single day. And so much of what is actually being harmed now is not necessarily just the physical body. Even take something like brain changes from interacting with media that might actually be enhancing our evolution, making us smarter and more resilient. We don't know that, right? But where there's definitely harm taking place is in invisible areas, the invaluable things in our life, the things that we can't digitize and mess with, we can't track and trace, we can't price because they are invaluable, they're invisible, and they're undescribable, right? So it's like the loss is painful because it's a loss that you can't articulate, and when you try and articulate it, you often tend to sound a little bit like a crazy person.
yeah.
Coming back to what you're saying about how hard it is to throw your phone in the sea, like people would say to you, why? I value the utility that I get from that so much more than these things that you can't even describe, and that's perhaps coming right back to square that circle to the beginning of our conversation, to the challenges of language. We need better words. We have to be able to name things in order to preserve things, and in order to name them, we have to find them, right? And I think that
Well,
that's the challenge.
this is the point. We don't see what we don't see.
Yeah.
And Marshall put it beautifully um, when he said, when invisible, they're invincible. Um, so how do we see what we can't see? How do you notice the unnoticeable? How do you perceive the imperceptible? Well, it's enough to know. I think the first step really is in realizing that there's more happening than we're aware of. And in fact, every day, every waking moment, much more happens to you than you either observe or understand. Even in your own body, you're not aware until I mention it that you're breathing, that your heart is putting blood through your system, that if you have a cut, you've got cells busy trying to fix it. Your hair is growing or falling out, your fingernails are growing. All these things are happening completely unaware, beneath your conscious awareness, but they all work together to keep you running, right? The same happens in cultures. All kinds of things are happening right now that we take utterly for granted, and have big impacts that we don't realize. But again, just because we don't take care of them doesn't mean we can't take care of them. And just about a century ago, this idea of ecology was born. We realize that nature, the physical environment around us, is a complex, dynamic thing, and that when you make changes in an area, you affect the total area, right? When you have a factory on the edge of the lake pumping pollution into it, and you have fish on the other end of the lake dying, or birds whose eggs are no longer strong enough to hold the babies within them, there's a relationship there. Uh, we have yet to really apply this understanding to technology. But this is what my grandfather meant by media ecology. Um, all the media literacy in the world isn't going to change the way that media reshape us on these fundamental levels. Media literacy is great. It's important to know that there are people behind technologies who have agendas, that that propaganda is alive and well, that people have ideological, political, commercial ends. But all those are actually all the content as well.
Mm.
Um, and it gets really hard to separate content from form. It gets easier when you take a broader view of technology, right? So think about a technology which isn't necessarily doesn't have an obvious content, right? So you can look at its effects. I like to think about something like cars and roads or air conditioners.
Mm.
Because of air conditioning, one society is possible that is not possible without it. Places are habitable. Work can be done during the hottest parts of the day. You can sleep easily at night or even get too cold. This is a technology which has reshaped our world. We can build 20, 30, 40, 50-story buildings without windows because we have air conditioning and heating. This was not possible. This is not possible in another kind of world. Um, that basic fact of technology to reshape, we shape our tools and thereafter they reshape us. Um, that nature of technology to affect us by its structure and its form more than by its content is a basic fact of all technology. But it becomes very difficult to see because we see the shiny thing. And, we like to argue about meaning and whether things are good and bad on a content level and think that that changes very much when we should know better by now.
We should know better by now, and we should keep asking and keep looking for those things that we are losing along the way. That even the things that we feel like we're losing that we can't actually see. I think that's a general comment for technology in general. We seem to we're creating more and more godlike technologies to give us more and more of what we need and what we want, when we want it, how we want it, where we want it. But at the same time, we forget that all of these technologies can only ever be an imperfect reflection of what it is that we truly want, in that we could only program the machine or the technology, whatever it is, whether it's hardware or software or physical tools, to give us what we can describe, right? So there's all these sort of bits and pieces that we're losing along the way. And sure, we are getting better at describing more and more of reality and what it is we want as we go along. But there has to be some sort of humility there that we can't reproduce ourselves, other than, sort of biologically speaking. But like you can't reproduce anything that you can't deliberately code or plan to get out. And then again, there's all that sort of detritus that comes in terms of all those side effects we've got to pay attention to. But in general, Andrew, I've kept you for far too long, so if there's any closing words, I'm going to give you the chance to wrap up anything that you wanted to say, clarify any point, leave any sort of hanging innuendos you like. And then if you want to tell people where to find you if you want to be found, go ahead.
Hanging innuendos. Well, I've appreciated our conversation. Uh, I think the thing is to notice, you know, be aware, take stock of what's happening. Um, consider deeply what's important and what you value. And then consider whether the choices you make reinforce or support those values or quite possibly make them untenable.
Mm-hmm.
The United States, for example, um, their system of government was formed at a very different time. Their constitution was a manuscript, right? It was written with by hand in pen and ink. Um, their system of democracy was developed when people got around on horseback, when it took months to get from one end of the country to the other. So it made sense to pick somebody to go to Washington for you because you couldn't possibly go there. Today, we can go there in seconds, in an instant, all of us to weigh in on something. Um, our values change when our technologies change, and it happens so quickly. The time to decide whether or not we want that change is before we make it. So again, I think the number one thing I urge people to do is the very difficult thing of stopping, pausing, slow down, walk instead of drive so that you can look around and see what it is you value about where you are in time and space. And then consider if you can make changes in your life to reinforce that when the next technology comes around. Maybe you can think, now hang on a second. Is this going to be a good thing for me and my family? Um, and then maybe you don't have to buy it. Crazy, crazy suggestion, but you know, I don't think the difficulty here is that innovation moves at the speed of light and regulation moves at the speed of paper. That is also the saving grace of regulation, but it is the very difficult thing to overcome when it comes to regulating technology.
Absolutely. Nothing further to add. And where can people find you if you want to be found?
Oh, sure. I run this thing called the McLuhan Institute, so .com, and then I'm on Twitter and social media places. I'm pretty easy to find.
Excellent. And we'll put whatever links you need into the show notes. But Andrew, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Take care.
That's right, I'm wearing red. I did that very deliberately to try and capture your attention instead of my usual black. I did that because I've got quite an important and very exciting, for me at least, announcement. And that is that our new book, Rescuing Our Republic, which has been written in conjunction with my friends and colleagues at Discourse ZA, is now out and about in bookstores across South Africa and available online for anyone else that is curious about South Africa. And as I've said before, as a futurist and a trained analyst and economist, I do think that South Africa is one of the clearest bellwethers as to where the weird Western world is headed. And as such, there's something you can learn from us at the bottom of Africa. We're ahead of quite a few of the trends that you're just wrapping your heads around. Anyway, this book is based on some of our most popular and most revealing, interesting and important conversations that we've had over the last couple of years at Discourse ZA, which is a YouTube channel you should absolutely subscribe to. It's also available as a podcast if you're interested in anything to do with politics, philosophy and economics. But the conversations in this particular book are focused on, as the title says, rescuing our republic, or more specifically, what civil society and individuals should be thinking about and doing and starting if they are interested in investing in a future for South Africa that we actually want to be a part of. Anyway, I would love for you to read this book and to give it to someone either that you like or that you hate, because the purpose of this book is to kickstart conversations around big, interesting, ugly even, but important ideas that are worthy of debate. So if you're planning on being bored or understimulated at a family or friend event this festive season, this is the book you need to give you the conversation starters to start a debate or a fight with those who you love or love to hate most.